As an undergraduate.
Well, thank you all for coming to this presentation. I am absolutely delighted because I get to showcase one of the brilliant faculty that our university has hired in recent times to embellish and enhance our academic profile. She joined Wayne State University in 2006 as a member of the history department. And the history department has recently been mentioned several times as one of the showcase departments in our university. So that's wonderful. And she came to us educated in some of the best schools in our country. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago in 1985, and MA from the Ohio University in 1990, and a PhD from Cornell in 1997. And since then, she has been a member of several important history associations, including the Organization of American Historians, the Social Science History Association, Phi Beta Kappa, and several others. So she's a specialist in 20th century U.S. politics and women's history. She has a book published in 2007 entitled The Big Vote, Gender, Consumer Culture, and the Politics of Exclusion, 1890 through 1920. Her most recent book is a collection of new essays she edited in 2008, edited on the 2008 election, which is called Obama, Clinton, Palin, Making History in 2008. And if you saw the advertisement about Wayne today, a picture of the advertisement for that book is there. She has won several grants, including nearly $1 million from the U.S. Department of Education, the Bunton Institute for the Study of Women at Harvard University, and several presidential libraries. And in 2009-2010, she won a grant in the Humanity Center's open competition. That was a very competitive competition, and she won it for a project entitled Visualizing Democracy, Presidential Campaign Advertisement, and the Remaking of American Citizenship. She's a member of the advisory board of the Center for the Study of Citizenships here. So she is highly qualified to talk to us today on the 2012 presidential election in historical perspective. So please welcome to the podium with applause, Professor Liette Gidlow.
An overwhelming introduction. I'll try to deliver 10% of that. So, anybody see a debate last night? Let's figure out who won. Anyone think Romney won? Oh, come on. Just a bunch of liberal academics. And I think Obama won. Anyone think it wasn't clear? Anyone think it doesn't matter? That could be. That could be. I thought that today I'd like to focus our attention on another issue of debate. Certainly, substantive issues have been part of the what's gotten attention in this recent electoral cycle. Certainly, there are debates about domestic policy or foreign policy, what to do with respect to Iran, what to do with respect to Syria, what to do about the economy, what to do about jobs and healthcare. There is also another debate, I think, that falls prior to that precedes that, and that's the one I'd like to focus our attention on today. And I think it's a rather curious issue to have a debate over. but I think it's fair to say that we've been having a debate, a rather bigger contest, over who gets to vote in the first place. A dozen states since 2008 have passed new voter ID laws. Their legal status is being adjudicated, continues to be adjudicated. Within the past month, Texas's new voter ID law has been thrown out by a federal court. New voter ID laws in Pennsylvania and South Carolina have been upheld, though judges there have required that their implementation follow the November election this year. Since 2008, the U.S. Department of Justice has brought 37 lawsuits against states and localities for violations of the Voting Rights Act and other statutes designed to protect voting rights. 10 of those lawsuits have been brought this year alone. The jurisdictions being challenged in these lawsuits range from Alaska to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they include Michigan, which was in which a complaint was filed for allegedly having failed to provide absentee ballots in a timely manner to military personnel and citizens overseas. Apart from voter ID challenges, other states have conducted non-routine purges of voter registration lists using questionable criteria or tactics, such as presumptively removing voters from eligibility lists and then asking them to prove affirmatively their eligibility in order to be returned to the rolls. Arkansas, for example, conducted a purge by comparing their list of registered voters to a list of aliens maintained by the Department of Homeland Security, a list that DHS says is neither complete nor accurate, and one that often fails to update citizenship status if a person receives citizenship after they have received a driver's license. Florida used the same list for its purge, which resulted in a purge in which 82% of those removed from the rolls were Latino, African American, or Asian American. Voters who responded to a letter asking them to present themselves to election officials to document that they were indeed American citizens. Among those, Florida officials found that only 0.0002% of the people on their purge list were ineligible to vote. In other words, voter qualification issues have received an enormous amount of attention this year. The LexisNexis search for news stories that uses the terms voter ID or purge, in other words, search terms that are very narrow and very precise, turned up more than 3,000 news stories in 2012 alone. And all of this, one might think, might be a bit strange, because hasn't the question of universal suffrage in the US been settled for a very long time? Both parties certainly celebrate participatory democracy and call on Americans to turn out at the polls. Candidates who represent a wide range of ideological perspectives recognize that electoral participation is essential in a representative system of government. Many Americans criticize foreign governments that don't permit their people to participate in democratic decision-making. So why the fight about who gets to vote? It turns out that the question of who votes in a democracy, in this democracy, is not settled. If the US has a long history of democratic ideals, it has an equally long history of deep concern over democratic practice. The contest in 2012 over who can vote is one more chapter, I would argue, in a long story of second thoughts about universal suffrage. And indeed, the term universal suffrage might well be one that we would put in quotation marks, because it is not something the US has or has ever had in its history. I'll begin by looking at two constitutional amendments that rectified two of the most obvious exclusions from the electorate. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, which enfranchised African American men, and the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, which enfranchised American women. Then I'll bring the discussion into the present and consider disfranchisement 21st century style. I don't mean to suggest that there's a straight line between 1870 and 1920 and today. History certainly is complicated, but I do believe that historic concerns over who can vote reverberate in today's controversies over who gets to cast ballots that count. The 15th Amendment was one of 3 amendments. This is a suggestion of some of the news coverage that the issue of disfranchisement and purges has gotten in the past year. The 15th Amendment was one of 3 amendments added to the Constitution in the wake of the Civil War. Prior to the 15th Amendment, Congress had tried and in considerable measure succeeded in enfranchising black men who had once been enslaved. The Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 ordered Union generals to register loyal Southerners and freedmen to vote. It also ordered them to oversee an electoral process in which voters selected delegates to constitutional conventions that would write new state constitutions, constitutions that were required to enfranchise African American men, and constitutions that would make these states eligible for readmission to the Union in good standing. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, set up penalties for states that denied suffrage to men who were otherwise eligible. With the law behind them and the federal army on the ground to enforce it, African American men in the South voted during Reconstruction in great numbers. Indeed, part of the effect of their ballots can be seen in the fact that by 1877, about 2,000 African American men had won election to local, state, and federal office in the former Confederate states. Still, there were problems. A recalcitrant President Andrew Johnson never accepted the legitimacy of black suffrage and worked assiduously to undermine their enfranchisement. For example, he replaced generals who were vigorously enforcing the law with generals who did not. This being one of many reasons that Congress impeached Johnson and nearly removed him from office in 1868. To settle the question of black suffrage once and for all, Congress passed, and in 1870, the requisite number of states ratified the 15th Amendment. Now, the operative language in the 15th Amendment is quite succinct. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This is what it says. What is at least as important is what it does not say. It does not affirmatively guarantee the right of people of all races, colors, or whatever previous condition of servitude to vote. It's not an affirmative protection. It just says that states can't deny the right to vote on these grounds. Presumably, that permits states to deny eligibility on other grounds. In other words, loopholes you could drive a truck through, and in fact, that ends up being the undoing of the effectiveness of this amendment some years later. Now, despite ratification, black male suffrage remained controversial, and indeed white supremacists worked for decades to actually repeal the 14th and 15th Amendments. This is an article from the New York Times talking about a group of legislators in Mississippi working for repeal of the 15th Amendment. The repeal movement was ultimately unsuccessful, but repeal was hardly unthinkable. It received backing from powerful members of Congress, such as Senator John Tyler Morgan of Alabama, who served in the Senate for 30 years, and during his tenure served as chair of the Rules Committee and chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Representative T.S. Williams, a member of the House from Mississippi, served as minority leader of the House, and he sponsored a repeal amendment, an effort that drew support not only from like-minded Southerners, but from some Northern members of Congress as well. For example, a member from New York by the name of Bork Cochran. And in fact, in the years after the federal troops were withdrawn from the South, African American men were in fact almost completely disfranchised. These voters faced every kind of electoral chicanery, every kind of legal hurdle, and ultimately great waves of terror and lethal violence. Over the course of decades, and despite great resistance on their part, African American men lost the ability to exercise their right to vote. Procedures such as poll taxes, literacy tests, 8-box balloting procedures, and others were devised so that white men whose votes were desired could be enfranchised, and everyone else whose votes were not desired could not pass those hurdles. For example, literacy tests were not standardized tests of understanding or competence in reading. Rather, a registrar could decide whether to administer the test, to whom it should be administered. They could administer a test of their choosing, and they decided if the answers were correct. In other words, they could apply their discretion to let through whom they wanted and to deny suffrage to those they chose. 8-box balloting procedures, for example, were used in South Carolina, where the ticket for each office had to be cast in its own box. So different offices had different boxes in which the ballots had to be placed. The only problem was the boxes weren't labeled, and voters had to rely on the guidance of poll workers to put the ballot in the correct box, and ballots that were not in the correct box didn't count. They were thrown out. The Supreme Court facilitated this disfranchisement by rendering a series of decisions that drastically limited the scope of the 14th and 15th Amendments. In 1890, some Republicans in Congress, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, made one last concerted effort to try to protect voting rights for African American men by introducing a bill which opponents labeled the Force Bill that would have put congressional elections under the supervision of federal authorities in the South. The so-called Force Bill failed, and indeed a few years later in 1896, Republicans won a resounding victory, not only winning the presidency, but piling up huge majorities in Congress, and put into place a coalition of voters that dominated national politics until the 1930s, until Franklin Roosevelt. After 1896, the Republican Party was so dominant in national politics that it did not need the votes of Southern African Americans in order to have a secure base of power. No longer needing those votes, the Republican Party effectively abandoned black male voters in the South. White supremacists solidified their hold over power through a nearly hegemonic Democratic Party, creating a solid South in which Republican opposition was effectively eliminated. Then, by restricting membership in the Democratic Party to people who were white, they were able to further protect and insulate their regime. By the 1910s, voter turnout among African Americans in the South was virtually zero. These second thoughts about suffrage were particularly destructive to the voting rights of African American men in the states of the former Confederacy, but Americans in every part of the country worried that suffrage had become too broad. Textbooks and the popular media quite uniformly characterized the period of African American enfranchisement in the South as one of Negro rule or domination, in which the people who were elected under that system served the Republic and their states poorly, arguing that these office holders were corrupt, licentious, and and unworthy of something as important as the franchise. But this sentiment extended beyond popular opinions of African American voters. In the late 19th and early 20th century, states outside the South enacted a wide range of disfranchising measures aimed especially at immigrant voters, ethnic Americans, working class voters, and urban dwellers. In the last quarter of the 19th century, 31 states permitted alien suffrage. If one had taken out first papers and declared an intent to become a citizen, one could be enfranchised on that basis. In other words, it was not necessary to be a citizen in order to vote in most American states. By the early 1920s, every one of the alien suffrage states had repealed those provisions. Residency requirements were extended and more strictly enforced inside and outside the South. In the early 20th century, states often required a year's residency in the state in order to be eligible to vote. But in the South, and in places such as Rhode Island, new residents were required to live not simply in the state, but in the locality for as long as 2 years before they could apply to register to vote. Literacy and other educational tests of understanding became standard procedure not only in the South, but also in California, Connecticut, Arizona, Oklahoma, Oregon, Delaware, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, New York, Washington, and Wyoming. Not just a Southern thing, and not simply directed at African Americans. By the end of the 1920s, 46 states required some sort of registration for at least some of their voters, city dwellers, if not all residents of the state. Personal registration, in which prospective voters had to present themselves to clerks, usually had to be renewed, in some places as often as every year. And a third of the states restricted registration periods to 7 days or less. These changes disproportionately disfranchised people who either lacked the citizenship papers or the English language skills, the reading skills needed to keep track of complicated requirements. The sorry fate of the 15th Amendment is well known, but the failures of the 19th Amendment are not. And that is the subject of new work that I'm involved in right now, a new research project. The ratification of the Women's Suffrage Amendment remains one of the high points, one of the shining examples of the march of American democracy and a signal achievement in the emancipation of women in the US. After all, it enfranchised about half the American population at once, introducing, on paper at least, nearly universal suffrage for the first time in the US. Every US history textbook, and with the exception of one, every US women's history textbook teaches that the 19th Amendment ended a 75-year struggle for women's enfranchisement. I'm finding in my research, however, that there is abundant evidence that the 19th Amendment was in fact followed by a period of mass disfranchisement of American women. African American women in the Jim Crow South, women of Mexican heritage, also targets of a sort of Jim Crow, Asian women prohibited from naturalizing, and many of their US-born children, women without an independent income in states that required payment of poll taxes. All of these women found that despite constitutional assurances, personal and political realities prevented them from exercising the suffrage. Sometimes husbands controlled the family finances and felt they could not or otherwise would not pay poll taxes for their wives. Some women encountered resistance by local elections officials who refused members of some ethnic or racial groups. In some states, women of color found themselves banned from the polls wholesale as a matter of policy, or the consequence of widespread campaigns of intimidation and violence. This research is showing that this disfranchisement took place, at least in the South, despite massive campaigns on the part of African American women in 1920 to register and vote. In some localities, these women succeeded, or at least some of them succeeded, but more often African American women were turned down, and they wrote to the NAACP and the Department of Justice to voice their complaints. Some reported that they had failed questionable literacy tests. Some were given the runaround until the registration period had expired. In Hampton, Virginia, Mrs. Allen Washington complained to the NAACP that she and a friend had made repeated visits to the registrar's office, each time being told to return at a later date. On the last day of the registration period, they were simply refused, a staff person admitting to her as the clock ran out on the registration period that, quote, "To tell you the truth, we're not going to be bothered with a lot of colored women." 28 women from Columbia, South Carolina signed affidavits stating that they had been told to take a literacy test other than the one prescribed by the state. They protested that, quote, "white women were not required to go through this illegal routine." They and 4 other women sued to try to reverse the registrar's decision, but a county judge threw out their complaint. A reporter later sought out the elections officials in question and described them as, quote, "about as ignorant a group of ivory heads as ever disgraced this section." In Fulton County, Georgia, Registrar Lucian Harris suspended the registration of women altogether, claiming that he needed to redeploy his staff to more urgent matters. Almost as an aside, that very same news story noted that, quote, "Mr. Harris said that the registration of Negro women has been at least 10 to 1 heavier than the registration of white women, and that there were automobiles hauling Negro women to the courthouse Tuesday morning when he closed the books." In Muskogee, Oklahoma, when the registrar there was approached by a group of African American women wanting to register, he simply resigned his office. Some women who tried to register were subject to intimidation and threats of violence, and many women who succeeded in registering found that come election day, either they were denied ballots at the polls, or the environment had become so dangerous that they didn't dare try to go vote. Florida was home to deadly election violence that targeted African American voters in 1920. Women in Jacksonville, Florida, then the largest city in the state, were arrested for trying to register. And those arrests spread both fear and resolve through the local community. Mrs. Janie Lowdry, the author of this letter here, which comes from the Library of Congress, the archives of the Library of Congress, wrote to the NAACP reporting on what was happening in Jacksonville. She explained, quote, "that I have talked with a great many colored women, and they say they're afraid to go and cast their votes. See what a quandary we are in, and without the help of a most high and just God and this great NAACP, we here in the South would be completely helpless." Mrs. Lowdry, however, didn't leave it to God and to the national NAACP offices. In this letter, she asked for the address of the local branch so that she could join. The black registration in Jacksonville was reported to be very high, and white supremacists organized to prevent the new registrants from voting. A Republican campaign official reported that 1,000 members of a revived Klan paraded the streets of Jacksonville in disguise on the night of the 30th of October, 1920. That is, soon after the registration period had closed and soon before the November election. An investigation by the NAACP found that their efforts to intimidate succeeded only in part. More than 4,000 registered African Americans showed up at the polls anyway and were turned away. Local and national observers breathed a sigh of relief when Election Day passed without major violence in Jacksonville. And the NAACP used the promise of 1,000 affidavits of voters testifying to their disfranchisement in Jacksonville to win hearings before a congressional committee and also before A. Mitchell Palmer's Department of Justice. Jacksonville escaped major violence on Election Day, but such threats could not be ignored. The Election Day race riot in Okasee, Florida made that abundantly clear. This town is 9 miles west of Orlando. In 1920, it had about 1,000 residents, about a third of them African American. The Jacksonville Times-Union blamed the violence there on, quote, unregistered Negroes who demanded ballots, including a man reported elsewhere to be Mr. July Perry, who was a registered Republican. Perry was reported to have threatened to return to the polls, this time with a gun, but a Republican campaign official from Florida who investigated the events afterwards came to a very different conclusion. Alexander Ackerman said instead that the situation in Okasee had been brewing for some time. He wrote to a Republican U.S. Senator that, quote, at Okasee it was rumored for weeks that not a single African American would be permitted to vote. Ackerman believed that Perry tried to vote but left quietly when he was turned away, and that the violence started when, quote, a number of armed men went to Perry's house after the polls closed without a warrant and without authority of law to arrest him. When the white men approached Perry's property, apparently 2 of them were shot and injured, including Orlando's former police chief, Sam Salisbury, who was shot in the arm. Now, why Orlando's former police chief is in Okasee on Election Day is a question that perhaps gives us some insight into the situation. Newspapers from as far away as New York breathlessly reported the events of the next few days. White, quote, reinforcements began to arrive, men from nearby Crown Point and Winter Garden, and, quote, 50 carloads of men from Orlando. Their purpose, in the words of a Jacksonville paper, was to, quote, help preserve order. The New York Dispatch on November 2nd described the scene as a, quote, bloody battle. Quote, the colored men are barricaded in the house of July Perry, and their dead and wounded cannot be gotten to. The white forces are said to be fighting at a great disadvantage to dislodge the colored forces. A November 3rd update in the same paper reported that the fight was continuing and repeated that, quote, the Negroes are heavily armed with every advantage in their favor. Hard to imagine. The Dispatch reported that a total of 6 people were killed in the violence, 2 African American and 4 white, but Ackerman in his report afterwards disagreed. Quoting his report, for 2 or 3 days the community ran riot. I do not believe it will ever be known how many Negroes were killed. Every Negro schoolhouse, church, and lodge room in that vicinity was burned, in some instances with women and children occupying the house. Remaining members of that community fled and relocated to nearby towns, including Orlando, Apopka, and Zellwood. The African American community in Okasee was eradicated, and census data shows that not a single African American person resided there for 40 years. Currently, a filmmaker by the name of Bianca White is preparing a documentary about the Okasee massacre. She claims, here I quote, the settlement of those that escaped the massacre had and continues to have a direct effect on the communities they fled to. Thus, the disenfranchisement of the African American community in Okasee continues to have a broad impact on Central Florida. The problem of disfranchisement in the 1920s was not limited to the South, wasn't even limited to the 1920s. Apparently, disfranchisement in other communities of color in other parts of the nation was not unusual as well. Cynthia Roscoe argues that Mexican American women in the 1920s broadly failed to vote. Activist Ed Eider from Austin, Texas, recalled the disfranchising effects of poll taxes on Mexican American women and men in the 1940s. Quoting Eider, to the working people, the ones that had to pick cotton and all that, $1.75 was quite a lot of money. And for 2 people in a marriage, husband and wife, to come up with $3.50 or what have you, that was money, you know. It was a big hindrance, no question about it. Thomas Guglielmo documents the exclusion in the 1940s of Mexican Americans from voting in Texas's white primaries. That is, the Democratic Party primaries, the only elections that mattered in what was effectively a one-party state. Some exclusionary policies may have dated back to statehood. Arizona granted women suffrage when it became a state in 1912, but Mexican Americans there, including women, were still largely barred from the polls. Idaho enfranchised women in 1896, but specifically excluded persons of Chinese descent. Voting rights for immigrants from Asia was a non-starter because they were barred from naturalizing until 1943 in the case of Chinese, and 1952 in the case of Japanese. But even their American-born children often faced obstacles to voting, despite measures such as those passed in California in 1926 and Oregon in 1927 that enfranchised Chinese Americans for the first time. In World War II, some Americans on the West Coast called for the disfranchisement of Japanese Americans again. This new research highlights the necessity of looking at the fate of the 19th Amendment in the context of families and communities. Gender is not enough to explain the exclusion of these women from the polls. Indeed, it's clear that their exclusion also had a great deal to do with their race, ethnicity, class. It's possible that other aspects of their identity may turn out to be important as well. Marital status clearly mattered. The record contains abundant examples of husbands and wives who went to try to register together, spouses trying to register together. And in communities in which a few African American men, for example, were enfranchised, in the early 1920s, they frequently conducted workshops of a sort in churches and in homes in order to teach newly enfranchised women how to navigate the system. An inclusive and intersectional approach will help us understand that for many women, what one historian termed the century of struggle to secure the vote lasted much longer than 100 years. For many women, the ratification of the 19th Amendment was not the triumphant end of the story, but rather the beginning of one more chapter of a very long struggle. The stories of the 15th and 19th Amendments make clear that enfranchisement remained contested even after constitutional changes, but the story of disfranchisement is not one for the history books. It's one that continues in our own day. So why has the contest in 2012 been so much about who is eligible to vote? Why the wave of voter ID laws and purges of election rolls? The explanation for this episode of efforts to disfranchise, I believe, can be found in a chain of events that extends from the present back to the 1990s. The key points in that backward chain include the 2008 election, in which electoral participation by Hispanic and non-white voters grew substantially. Then back to the 2000 election, which was so close that it was ultimately decided by the US Supreme Court. And finally to the late 1990s, in which Congress took measures that also expanded the electorate. 2008 was a pivotal year for electoral participation. Applications to register to vote jumped nearly 42% between 2006 and 2008, and nearly a fifth of those registrants were people who were registering for the first time. At the voting booth, 2 million more African Americans voted in 2008 than in 2004. Within that community, the increase was greatest among young African Americans, that is, aged between 18 and 24. Voter turnout rates for African Americans and whites were nearly equal that year at about 64-65%, which was a first given that voter turnout among African Americans had historically lagged behind that of whites. But this voter mobilization was not limited to African Americans. Some 2 million more Latinos voted in 2008 than 2004, and 600,000 more Asian Americans as well. As a result, the non-Hispanic white share of the voting electorate dropped from 79 to 76% in 2008. 3 percentage points, but really a pretty dramatic drop for a single electoral cycle. And Democrats were largely the beneficiaries of these trends in registration and turnout. These changes in the composition of the electorate matter when elections are very close, and the 2000 election remains fresh in the minds of today's presidential candidates and the teams that are trying to elect them. In 2000, the election came down to Florida. Whoever won that state's 25 electoral votes would win the presidential election. The initial count of votes indicated that George W. Bush had won the state, but his margin was so narrow that it triggered an automatic recount. The automatic recount showed Bush to be the winner by 537 votes. Meanwhile, Democrats asked for a hand recount of ballots in several counties in Florida in which they believed there were errors in the counting that might lead to an undercount of Democratic votes. The Republicans in turn went to court to try to stop the hand recount from proceeding. In the course of the investigations, it became clear that the punch card style ballots in use in heavily Democratic counties were unreliable as far as counting went, because the little holes that voters were supposed to punch out with a stylus often didn't come out completely. And that led to errors in reading the cards by the optical scanners in the voting, in the counting process. These punch card balloting systems, as I said, were used predominantly in counties with large numbers of minority and poor voters, counties with majority Democratic registrations. The 2000 election was ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court more than a month after Election Day. The Supreme Court was bitterly divided, and the vote there, 5-4, to end the recounts, echoed the closeness of the election in the nation at large. And when elections are decided by razor-thin margins, the questions of who can vote and whose votes count become key. But part of the expansion of the electorate preceded 2008, and even the 2008 expansion was facilitated by changes in registration procedures that date back to the 1990s. In 1993, Congress enacted the National Voter Registration Act, or Motor Voter Law. Motor Voter required states to offer citizens a chance to register to vote by mail and by when they apply for or renew a driver's license, and at all offices that provide public assistance or state-funded disability programs, services. The Motor Voter Law went into effect in 1995. I found one study that tracked its effects longitudinally through 2004, and that study shows that the Motor Voter Law has increased voter registration by about 3%, and increased it disproportionately among low to moderate income voters. So why are we still fighting about suffrage? In my view, the controversy today is a consequence of the closely competitive nature of the presidential elections today, and of increases in voter registration among demographic groups that tend to favor Democrats. Why does disfranchisement still matter? What's at stake here in this controversy, in these issues? Certainly it matters because in tightly contested races, whether presidential or down ballot, it can make a difference in outcomes. But it also matters because, in my view, enfranchisement is an expression, and perhaps the most important expression, of a person's status in civic society. Enfranchisement is an official recognition of a person's legitimacy in civic society, in public decision-making. A person who's enfranchised is officially recognized as a person who's a legitimate decision-maker in public affairs, a person who is acknowledged and authorized and empowered not only to help make public decisions, but to help make public decisions that other people must abide. The current contest over disfranchisement reflects, I think, continuing discomfort in this country with the idea that people of color, or people who are poor, are legitimate decision makers in this society, that they are people who can legitimately make decisions that other people are required to obey. And as long as that discomfort remains, especially when elections are close, the contest over who gets to vote and whose votes count, I think, will continue. Thank you. Hi.
Time for questions.
Yeah.
Early on in your presentation, you had mentioned the president who didn't want to allow the votes in the South. Was that a Democrat or Republican?
Andrew Johnson?
Yes.
You're talking about? Well, he had switched parties. There's a realignment that takes place in the 1850s, and he switches parties at one point in time.
At the time he did that, was it a Democrat or Republican?
He was elected as a Republican, elected president as a Republican. He was Lincoln's vice president. Okay, so ran on the Republican ticket.
But then he switched to be a Democrat.
He had Democratic, he had been identified as a Democrat earlier in his career, and also later. So he was this was a time of fluid partisan identifications because the Republican Party is being created at that point in time, in part out of the old Whig Party and the Democratic Party. And there's a sectional realignment, and so there are people whose voting identities or partisan identities change in this time period.
Traditionally, in the beginning of the formulation of these amendments, which party opposed?
The Democrats.
They opposed
Yes,
all
yes.
of this.
Generally, yes. Yeah, this was very much, the Reconstruction Amendments were very much the work of the Republicans. Great, Kidada, and then Janine.
Oh, I just had a quick question about what was the, and you may have mentioned it, but I don't think I heard it. What was the opposition or concern about urban dwellers?
Urban dwellers were seen, put this in the context of a time in which immigration has accelerated dramatically, and that immigration at the turn of the century is a new wave of immigration, right? Immigrants are coming from different regions of origin than they traditionally had. And many of the new immigrants are from Eastern and Southern Europe, from Italy, from Poland, Russian Jews, Greek Orthodox, and others who, in the minds of some, are seen as not quite white. Their religious identifications are not traditional Protestant, and they're seen as people who are different and sometimes constructed as racially different. Well, many of these immigrants congregate in cities and become incorporated into urban machines. And so they are seen by many as corrupt voters, and partisan voting is seen by many as a corrupt kind of voting. In other words, people who would trade their vote for a job or a bucket of coal. And so there are concerns about voters who are congregated in these cities.
It's more tied to immigration.
To immigration and to class.
And to class, yeah.
Just one little thing, talking about, when you're talking about the recent attempts, I mean, another big issue, not to add, but just the whole issue of ex-cons, right? And how that tracks with these other groups, that somehow it's a way to disenfranchise people without actually saying why you're disenfranchised.
Well, to do it on a basis that's ostensibly non-racial.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
And in some states, such as Florida and Alabama, that have permanent felon disfranchisement, these people lose their votes forever.
Right.
And as a result, there's an astounding proportion of the black male population in those states that is permanently disfranchised.
Yeah. Well, you know, Heather Thompson was here on Thursday. Did you hear her? Anyway, she talked about this extensively, and so I've just been thinking about it ever since she came and gave that talk. It just resonated with what you're saying. More to what you're doing. So I
Can I add a point to that?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And then, do you want to hear your other point? There are other aspects of it that I think are really interesting and compelling as well. In some states, apportionment of districts takes into account, counts in the population, people who are in prisons upstate, counts them for purposes of representation, but then does not permit them to vote. Which of course gives those districts, arguably, a disproportionate influence in state legislatures, that kind of thing. So
she gave a whole list of districts in Michigan that were only squeaked over to have representation because of the prison population.
Isn't that amazing?
And of course, as the district she used as examples, the population there is overwhelmingly white, and the prison population tends to be more African American. And so she spoke at length about this, so many of the perversities really about
Sure.
this whole issue.
Sure, I think arguably it's a challenge to Baker v. Carr and the idea of one person, one vote.
Yeah.
And I think, I haven't looked at data to validate this, but my sense is that the return to an emphasis on felon disfranchisement is a long-term response to the Voting Rights Act of '65, okay? Because with the enfranchisement of these populations, there's an attempt to find other ways to disfranchise. And, the drug war of the '80s is not very long after that, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
no,
so it's a
she-
way to
yeah.
respond in the long term to those kinds of
She talked about
concerns.
that
So
a lot, so.
I know you had another
No, go ahead,
question.
sorry, if there's time, you can come back, but I don't wanna
Okay, great. Tom?
I'm just curious about this in a sense, talking about disenfranchisement in general. I'm just thinking of the idea of it in terms of like social class in the sense, we have these wild disparities of income where, lots of very wealthy and very poor people, the income gaps are increasing and that sort of thing. And then we have this idea of disenfranchisement growing generally, and I'm just thinking if it's, in a sense, an attitude of both historically and currently of all these other, looking at it, I guess, people who are in positions of power or authority are simply saying that all these other messy people don't have a quote, that we don't want them interfering with our pure little system. And that would mess up our power base. So let's just sort of exclude them out. So I'm thinking in terms of like social class cleavage being so huge that it makes race and gender and all these other things part of it, but a bigger thing of elitism more broadly, of keeping the elites in power, either both liberal and conservative, who then can be the major power brokers about what's going on. So it affects, sort of like cuts off democracy. That you have too much of the mass of people having a voice. So a power elite can sort of like dictate.
I think that there are a number of really interesting things going on here. Class is clearly extremely important, and part of an important argument in today's public discourse is that economic success is a qualification for making decisions for the public. It qualifies one as a decision maker or public leader. And I think it's just a very interesting way of looking at things. But we also know that class and gender and race and ethnicity and many other factors are mutually constitutive, right? Class is raced and race is gendered, and these things don't exist, pulled apart. There are problems with trying to pull them apart and isolate one over another. So class tracks in certain ways with ideas about race and sometimes ideas about gender as well. So these things they help to constitute each other. They're not isolated effects. So.
Right, there's also the issue of age. You think about some of the people, some of the elderly who are being disfranchised because they don't have birth certificates. They weren't born in hospitals. They were, born, on their family, in their family home, or they were delivered by midwives. And at a time period where, it wasn't mandatory, or in a state where it wasn't required for them to have a birth certificate. So how do you prove citizenship?
I think it's
in some of those circumstances, if you are elderly, and then that also tracks in terms of class.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's some really interesting echoes. in Pennsylvania, where the voter ID law was just upheld, in the process of the court proceedings, the state, the Commonwealth was asked, you know, what happens in this circumstance, this circumstance, this circumstance if a person does not have a birth certificate or doesn't have the ID they need in order to get the voter ID, right? And ultimately, you know, if they didn't have a birth certificate and didn't have or maybe didn't have a social security card, or maybe didn't have a passport, or maybe didn't have, you know, each of these documents, the final way that a person could qualify would be if two people testified on their behalf to the registrar that they know this person to be a citizen. One of the ways that a few African Americans were able to qualify to register to vote in the Jim Crow South was to have two white people testify informally to the character of this person. Okay, so there are some very powerful echoes in ways that we aren't even necessarily attuned to.
I think one thing that's really interesting to jump off of age as well is people with disabilities. I know in Pennsylvania specifically, especially with like absentee, just getting an absentee ballot is so hard that, I mean, you make it, aside from breaking HIPAA laws, you have to go to your doctor, get proof that you actually are disabled and unable to go and vote, and then a majority of the time your polling places are not accessible to make it so you're actually able to go there. Like I know someone that in her city, every single polling place is not accessible to people with disabilities. So even if she was able to go to a different location, she can't go there anyways. And it's, you know, so it's bringing in the fact that what if someone's not even financially able to go to the doctor, because most doctors, if they haven't seen you or whatever, if you need to actually have a letter, because they need documentation of what's wrong with you, or, you know, of your disability, that it brings so much more into this. And especially, I mean, again, with people aging and not being able to go to the polling places, or, you know, needing absentee ballots, just continually making it harder and harder for people to be able to vote.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of having documentation is in some ways a very classed, a very ableist kind of social expectation, right? And it doesn't hold the same way in all communities, so that's an interesting point. Good, Rob?
I was just wondering if you have any more modern examples, perhaps from even this election, of disenfranchisement of working class Americans. Specifically, I thought I heard of some litigation that was in Ohio, but I was just wondering if you had any more information on how they would go about disenfranchisement in that situation.
Well, class tracks with race and ethnicity, right? So a lot of the lawsuits that are brought, for example, by the Department of Justice are dealing with violations of the Voting Rights Act that target protected classes in the legislation, right? And protected classes, poor people are not a protected class. Working class people are not a protected class under the legislation, right? But ethnicity, race, color, religion, gender, other attributes are defined as protected classes. And so that's why the litigation and the objections tend to track along lines of race and ethnicity. I was looking at what was the basis of these lawsuits, these 37 lawsuits in the past 4 years, and 10 this year alone. Many of them are about dilution of voting strength that has come about because of redistricting post-2010. Okay, and sometimes that's with respect to African American voting strength in particular districts. More often it has been with respect to voting strength of Hispanics. But in a couple of cases out west, in Arizona and in New Mexico, it's been with respect to voting strength of Native Americans. There was also a case in North Dakota that was along those lines as well. Many of the other violations being identified and challenged have to do with getting absentee ballots out in time to people who are overseas, including people in the military. So those things tend to be the focus of the recent lawsuits, not class specifically.
Yeah, I heard a case on the news recently where apparently some voters got their absentee ballots. This was in the same area and others didn't. And it was even in the same family where one would have gotten their ballot and the other one didn't. And it was kind of like, well, what is going on? And it gets you to thinking about not only about the idea of but the sense of organization. You know, who is it that decides? And then how is it that some of these people who get to decide, who are printing up all these ballots, how do they, organize? Why aren't they ready for this? Why didn't they anticipate this? This sort of thing.
Yeah, these kinds of irregularities in procedure were something that Congress intended to address with the 2002 Help America Vote Act, which came out of, the debacle in Florida. And so they have worked to try to institute standard procedures, standard forms for registration, and standard procedures for how and when ballots are to be distributed, that kind of thing. But a lot of localities are having a hard time complying. I mean, it really relies on local election boards to enforce, and not all of them are well trained, not all of them have good resources, and it's just regular folk trying to do a job, and sometimes it's well done and sometimes it's not well done. So, but when it's not well done, it can constitute a violation of voting rights.
So we're going to have Romney v. Obama in about a month's time?
Well, who can say? But it was really something when I taught my elections class in 2000, and the semester ended without us knowing the outcome of the election.
And this is my sort of last question or point. I wonder, we were looking at the things in terms of voter registration, but I'm also kind of curious to see what's going to happen with True the Vote.
Sure.
Have you heard, I don't know if you've heard about them, but it's their plan to challenge voters, to challenge workers at polling places, et cetera, on the day of the election. And so it'll be interesting to see what actually comes out of that. I know Representative Lewis was talking about holding a hearing before Congress, really going and calling them in to have them testify about what their intentions are. But it'll be interesting to see what happens on election day, not just what happens in terms of registration, etc.
Yeah, True the Vote is a Tea Party associated organization working for purity of the ballot. Eliminating any kind of what they see as fraud or corruption. They put up 40 billboards in Ohio in the past week, mostly in minority neighborhoods, reminding people that voter fraud is a felony, punishable by this particular jail term, and under some pressure those were recently removed. So.
I'd also heard that a lot of college students were getting their registration thrown out because they forgot to put their dorm room number on their address line, and I was kind of wondering what would the either the ramifications or who would that support more in the election by having all the college a lot of the college students, who would want those votes to be thrown out?
Well, it depends on localities and colleges.
I think it was mostly in Ohio, Ohio State or something.
Yeah. Some universities have a really, left identification, and some have a pretty right identification, so that may make a difference, though. Youth voters disproportionately supported Obama in 2008. Whether that'll be the case in 2012, one can only guess. But voting registration by college students is an enormously controversial issue, especially in small towns where they represent a large part of the population, and locals are sometimes resentful that people who don't live here on a permanent basis or are only here 9 months a year are registering and making decisions that everybody else has to abide. So it's an issue of controversy.
Yeah, I've also heard that part of this strategy involved in this campaign is also a kind of to make certain voters so frustrated and angry with the system that they will simply refuse to vote. So that way, without having to suppress voters, would be to actually just make them so disgusted that they won't vote. So that way that you won't have to officially disenfranchise people, but by making them disillusioned and not voting, you're in effect suppressing their vote.
Sort of the voting equivalent of self-deportation, right?
Yeah.
You just get people to do it themselves is much easier than having to pressure them in some way. So. Other questions or comments? Thank you so much. Thank you, Walter, and I also would like to give a special thank you to Rachel. I thank you for helping me do
I tried to like curtsy while sitting down.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate the help.
Yeah, no problem.
Appreciate the help. Thank you for the help.
I know.
But as punishment, you do have to.
You have to pose for clarification.